April 2018 was one of the more laid-back months in terms of films. Now, as I said before in a previous video, that I wasn't going to do individual reviews for all of the films of every single month. I would do one singular review for the headliner film for the month, and then do a compilation review of all the other films that I saw this past month. So in terms of April, I'm going to be doing a worst, meh, and best category. There are two worst, two mehs, and one best. So let's get into the worst films of April. Truth or Dare. To be quite honest, the concept of Truth or Dare could have worked better as a horror comedy. This is a film that I saw for free at a free event screening by Universal Pictures, and it is by far one of the worst films of the year. In fact, probably the worst horror film I've seen ever. This is a film that sets up rules that it blatantly breaks at the second act, and it doesn't have any sort of rectifications at all. The characters and characterizations of all of our leads are very stereotypical and bland, with no depth given. The lead actress, for the most part, was very wooden, but when it comes to her character, in terms of motivation, her character completely changes at the very end, in the third act, and it's probably one of the most distracting things I've ever seen. Let's also talk about the opening of this film. The opening of the film is done in such a stupid way that it made me laugh out loud at this fan event screening. And you know what? Everyone else did. This is a film that tries to take itself so seriously that honestly, the direction for this film went in the completely wrong direction. And that is something that could have been fixed. If this was a horror comedy, it probably would have worked well. In terms of the actual scares and kills, they're all very bland, including one about this guy with his pen that was heavily telegraphed, and I kind of figured from the first moment we see the pen, I'm like, yeah, he's gonna die with that pen. And to be quite honest, this film gets hugely spoiled from the trailers alone. There are certain plot points even in the trailers that are done, and when I see them in the movie, I'm like, okay, I know exactly how this movie's gonna go. And to that end, the marketing for this film is very, very bad at keeping any secrets. It's terrible. This is a terrible horror film that I'm probably going to get into more depth later on in my career. It is terrible. Don't ever see it. I Feel Pretty. Okay, to be honest, Amy Schumer isn't that great of a comedian, and I just don't like her style. She's not that enthusiastic of a comedian to me, and her Netflix comedy special didn't work for me at all. And when it came to I Feel Pretty, the actual message that it gets across is actually something that I would commend, because a lot of people, especially females, have a lot of image issues. There is this whole tendency to have this sort of pressure be put on people to look a certain way or to do that, and to have a message about being positive about your own body is something to be commended, and it's not necessarily focused upon in the mass media. Where it fails, though, is everything else. The comedy I didn't feel was very funny. It's not. And the acting, But what really drives this one home for me in terms of worst is the story and themes. It all feels very hollow. Everything about it. Like, the message is okay. I think the message itself is something that I can get behind, but everything else just felt very hollow and not very human. Like, as if someone had some sort of agenda they wanted to get across, and that was it. That's all they wanted to do with the movie. And in terms of story, in terms of actual narrative spine, in terms of theming, it's very, very low-key to even non-existent at times. And it also feels very hollow. And now we get into the meh category, starting with Rampage. Now, Rampage is based off of that one coin-op arcade game you saw at like a bar somewhere, and stars Dwayne The Rock Johnson, and the film is also produced by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and stars a bunch of CGI creatures that go beat 'em up. For a concept of this, the concept for this movie is honestly something that I got behind, you know? How do you turn a coin-operated game that had no story at all into a feature-length film? Well, you kind of create a story around it that has some sort of buddy sort of situation between a lead character and one of the monsters, and you just have them do stuff. And to that end, I kind of enjoyed it for the most part. This isn't a great film at all, but it is a guilty pleasure film. This is a film I could recommend to people that just want to, like, turn off their brains for a few hours and just watch as, like, stuff happens. There's not a lot of dramatic consequences. There's not like, every single plan that they come up with always works, and that's kind of the main flaw of this film, is that a lot of these gaps, like, in terms of narrative writing, if there's a goal that needs to be met, there needs to be some sort of gap between it. Like, you try one way, it fails, and you have to try to figure out another way. At no point in this film does the writing actually have those narrative gaps. Does it have those conflict gaps? And that's something that was kind of lacking in this film. Any sort of weight or any sort of damage, really. But Rampage, in terms of a third act, actually has one of the best, like, destruction sequences I've seen in terms of big battles in a big city sort of way. In terms of the acting, it is very cheesy, and the overall presentation and product is very over the top, but if you're looking for something to watch on a Saturday night with a bunch of friends, this is definitely one to, well, boot up. A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place on its surface to me was actually a kind of a really cool little idea. What if you had an entire horror film where the whole concept is if you even spoke really loudly, a bunch of monsters could come and kill you? And that's kind of what I liked about A Quiet Place for the most part. The directing and cinematography for this film were pretty good for the most part. Half of the actors worked really well, and in terms of the creatures, they actually looked really cool, especially in CG. Although the most surprising aspect about this film for me was the fact that this was produced by Michael Bay of all people. And that's saying a lot because Michael Bay doesn't produce a lot of great horror movies, and A Quiet Place is definitely something that I would recommend to some people. However, my biggest gripes with the film come from the story necessarily. The story and some of the character decisions. Like, there's a lot of dumb stuff that happens. This is a very dumb horror film. But in terms of some of the sequences that happen in this film, they work pretty effectively. And the ending gives a lot to be desired. And apparently now they've approved of A Quiet Place Part 2, which, okay, I'm fine with. Not exactly the best horror movie of the year, but I give it a pass. And now for the best category, and this is going to be a very awkward one, but Isle of Dogs. Yes, a movie that came out March 23rd actually managed to come here in April. And Isle of Dogs, for the amount of time I had to wait for it, the wait was mostly well suited for it. Now, this film also has like a lot of controversies around how the film lacks any sort of characterization of the Japanese characters, to which I could say, yeah. I mean, for a film that we're supposed to connect with the Japanese characters, considering that this is a film also about a Japanese society, we don't really know much about them. In fact, all their dialogue doesn't really have any subtitles, so we're just left to assume, you know, stuff that they say. The movie itself, though, is something that I would wholly recommend. Despite it not having the best of stories and some characters like, you know, Greta Gerwig's character, the American exchange student, she's only there to do one thing that technically one of the other characters could have done anyway. But overall, I did love this movie, despite my personal gripes with it. It's well animated, it's well acted, it has some quirky humor that doesn't fully work. I wouldn't necessarily call this Wes Anderson's masterpiece, but it does do a lot in terms of actual quality. The cinematography at times looks really good, and it's very much an homage to Japanese films, and I personally love it. And that is the monthly recap of the April film segment. Join me next month when we look at May, which is probably going to be the most driest of months, considering that there's not a lot of films that I'm really looking forward to other than Deadpool 2 and Han Solo. So, yep, that's it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.